Greetings. Thank you for tuning in to this video on the nature of Van Gogh. This lecture was presented live at the Lloyd Library on August 3rd, 2022. I'm Carol Mundy, a naturalist and speaker here in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been studying the life of Van Gogh for a number of years with the intention of dispelling the many myths that surround Vincent's life and career as a painter. We all know his name, but what do we really know about his life? Vincent was born at a time when old and new collided. In the time that he was painting, which was really only about a 10-year period where he was quite feverishly painting, 2,100 pieces of art and nearly 900 oil paintings, most of those done in the last 2 years of his life. Thankfully, Vincent was quite the letter writer, and those letters became the map or the benchmark for following his progress, understanding some of his feelings and emotions. Most of those letters were written to his brother, Theo, and preserved by Theo and then his wife after Theo's passing. We know so much, or we think we know so much about Vincent van Gogh, but we often have a very myopic view of Vincent's life, putting it all in one very small viewfinder. The object of this lecture is to help you open up that viewfinder and become more familiar with his life. Let's talk a little bit about his family. His mother was from The Hague. Now, The Hague is really the heart of the nation. This is really the spot where everything comes together. This is where the king lived. This is where all of the nations would come to visit. Art museums, lectures, libraries, theater, music, lots of royalty in that city. Incredible opportunities in terms of high culture. Vincent's father, named Doris, his family also from The Hague, but Vincent's father, known as Doris, actually grew up in a little bit smaller town named Benskoop. Doris studied to become a parson just like his father, and when he accepted a posting, it was in a tiny little town, Zundert. Now, to put this into perspective, The Hague had about 70,000 people living there at that time. That was about 1849, when Doris Van Gogh accepted this posting to Zundert. Zundert had about 3,000, mostly rural, mostly tiny little farms where peat harvesting and timber were some of the main forms of commerce. He hadn't met his wife yet, Anna Carbentus, and the way that these two came together is that Doris's older brother also happened to be named Vincent Van Gogh. He went by the name of Cent, and Anna's younger sister, Cornelia, had been dating, and he decided to marry. And the two families decided that perhaps Doris and Anna would be a good match. The two met and decided that would be a pretty good partnership, and so they were married. Anna, of course, dutifully packed up the home and moved to Zundert. As I mentioned, Zundert was very rural in comparison to where she had been living. They moved into the parsonage, the home that was provided for the parson of the church, the Dutch Reformed Church at that time. To give you a little bit of perspective, let me tell you about the way that home was provided. It's much different than most of the other homes in Zundert. The parsonage is described thus. The door opens into a long, dark room at the back, where the family actually live. The hall ended in a small kitchen. Beyond that lay a washroom and barn, all in one continuous, virtually lightless progression. The sole privy was behind the door of the barn. Unlike most people in Zundert, Anna Van Gogh did not have to go outside to use the loo. And I bring that forward again because this is part of the stature. She made it a point to make sure that the tiny little town understood the status of her husband, the parson, and herself. And so she really controlled the narrative. She controlled what they wore, who they visited, who they socialized with. In fact, even though this is described as an outpost in the wild and unfamiliar land to her, she did have a maid and a servant for housekeeping, a governess to help care and teach for the children, a gardener, and then a driver was also provided to them. As the family started to grow, we need to start on rather a sad note, and that is in 1852, on March 30th, Anna gave birth to a stillborn son named Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh. Unfortunately, this youngster died, was dead at birth, and they went ahead and celebrated his life with a full service in the church and a burial and a headstone. And the reason I bring this to your note is that that was so unusual for that time period. They move on and decide they're going to have more children. And 1 year to the date, another child is born. A young son is born. His name is Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh, born on March the 30th, 1853. And you can see by this notation that they had a number of children in a pretty quick succession over the course of about 14 years. Anna took great pains to make sure that her children were also being presented in that very strict environment. She controlled who they played with. She wouldn't let them play in the streets. She wouldn't let them go beyond the garden wall, although, of course, Vincent, being a very curious boy, wanted to know more about what was out there. Now, Anna, to her credit, did utilize quite a number of books. They were bibliophiles. They had a really wonderful collection of books. So she made sure that they were instilled with reading, languages, music. She taught them how to play the piano. She taught them many crafts and handicrafts, whether it was sewing or knitting or small woodcraft. But the one that stands out the most for me is the use of this particular book, originally written in 1845 by Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Karr. The original did not have any illustrations, but this version came out in 1851 and had some wonderful illustrations. There are a few there on the screen that you can see. Vincent was really moved by this and the advice of Karr to go and seek out nature to observe and draw and collect and describe what had been found. He set out starting collections. At about age 8, Vincent began collecting insects, bird nests, and eggs. He sketched many of these things while he was collecting them and cataloged them to the best of his ability at 8 years old. The large insect on the lower corner, this is the European stag beetle. I put that on there because he's just so striking. And it was noted in Karr's book. And here in Ohio, we have an almost identical beetle. This is the stag beetle found in the eastern parts of the United States. They're really quite tremendous. They're about 2 inches long. This is a male with great big pinchers and a beautiful kind of a shiny root beer color. And I'm sure that this would have been a beetle that young Vincent would have captured and identified for his collection. Vincent was always drawing, even in his earliest years. The picture on the screen is one of his earliest known drawings, which is a pencil sketch of a barn and farmhouse near their home in Zundert. It was given to his mother, Anna Van Gogh, and Vincent would have been about 9 years old at this time. As Vincent did go to school in the little village school located in Zundert, Anna had described this as maybe not the best situation for her children. She felt that it was too coarse. And so they decided to send Vincent off to a primary school in a town about 15 miles away. And in doing so, Vincent was already starting to kind of feel that abrasive feeling. His parents were always tied up. There were many more children in the house at the time. And you can tell by this map that he lived in many places, whether he was sent there because he was going to school or his parents moved because of his father's position in the church, or that he decided to try some jobs in different areas of the country. But when they sent him off to primary school, this was a life-changing event for Vincent. He may have felt abandoned. I mean, he was divided from his family, separated. When they brought this kind of angry young man to the school, he was the youngest student, which actually says a lot because his ability, his learning, skill at learning, he was really quite well educated, very well read, already spoke a couple of languages. So he's the youngest student. He's kind of a brainiac. He has red hair and fair skin, and he's the parson's son. And as you well know, this unfortunately can be a target for bullies. The 2 years there were quite kind of tumultuous, but he did all right. And then they decided he needed to go on to his secondary school, which was about 20 miles away. At this point, he's a teenager and really feeling that kind of abrasiveness with his parents, acting out as most teenagers might do. So now he is taken to a school where this is not a boarding school. And upon his arrival, he finds out that he is the only student that does not go home at the end of the evening to a family. Vincent's family have not only paid for his schooling, but they are paying for another family, an older couple without children, to provide care for Vincent while he's at school. Vincent tries to come home on holidays depending if there's money for ticket. After all, the parson doesn't have a big salary. But things were really getting tough. The family was growing, and on numerous occasions, Vincent would come home for holiday and no one would meet him at the train station, and he would end up walking the few miles back to his little village. At a certain point, going to this school, Vincent has just had enough. It's before his 15th birthday, and about 2 months before he's set to graduate. He quits. He just quits. He walks home. He walks home 20 miles to his family, and when they arrive, they are not inviting him in with open arms. They're embarrassed. How could you do this to us? People would have seen you walking on the road. What will they think? And they complained about this potential waste of money, that he threw away his opportunity. Well, after a number of months, almost a year at home in Noonan, at this point, Uncle Cent, that's Doris's older brother, kind of comes to the rescue, and he convinces the family to let Vincent go with him to The Hague to work at Guptill & Cie, which were renowned art dealers and art houses and galleries that had locations in The Hague, Paris, and London. Needless to say, Vincent's eyes were now wide open to the possibility of life beyond Zundert and Noonan. Imagine this. Now you have a 16-year-old who is brought into The Hague, again, a very large city compared to where he had been. Zundert and Noonan only about 3,000 or so families, where The Hague had about 70,000. He is intrigued. He's got the art museums, the libraries, the theaters, the symphonies, so many things to be engaged. And at the art gallery, he gets to see things he's never seen before, art from all over the world. He's meeting artists. He looks at the supplies that are available. He meets patrons and has discussions about the different varieties of art that are there. On the flip side of that, you have a young man of 16 years old living on his own at a boarding house. He's not living with his uncle. He's not under the watchful eye of any of them. And let's just say he's visiting some of the seedy sides of life. He continues his work with Guptill & Cie. However, he gets into a conflict with one of the managers, and he gets transferred from The Hague to London. And you might think that could be a good thing, but for Vincent, it was rather troubling. First of all, the Guptill & Cie location in London was a warehouse only, so you didn't have the patrons coming in. You didn't have that opportunity for face-to-face discussion or that good brain food that comes from talking about different styles of painting and different philosophies. And he just doesn't do well there at all. It's a very crowded, heavily burdened city with almost 5 million people. It's noisy and loud and dirty and dusty. He ends up getting transferred again, this time back to Paris, which the city of light, again, this incredible young man has these opportunities while he's in this city. And at a certain point, his brother is also brought into Paris. So the two young men are exploring, let's just say, kind of the underbelly of the city, because there is no supervision outside of their time at work. Unfortunately, that job doesn't work out so well for Vincent, and he ends up being asked to leave. He tries to follow in his father's footsteps in becoming a minister. Unfortunately, he doesn't pass the final test to get his posting. He enrolls in an evangelist school and takes some low pay or no paid positions in even tinier, poorer villages where he continues to work on his art, but is living on really a thread. No money, very little food, in abject poverty, but always working on his art skills. Throughout that time, when he has the availability and does have some money, he continues to paint. And during this time, when he comes back to Eton or in Noonan, when he's back with his family, again, feeling somewhat like a failure, but he's working on his skills as an artist, and so you're going to see lots of still life scenes, as well as paintings of people doing their work. the person weaving, the person who is cooking, the farmer out in the field. But still lifes really stand out because you don't have to pay that model to do that. And so there's lots of still lifes that end up in his collection. Vincent is constantly writing to his family, most often to Teo, but also to his sisters now and then, and mother. And during this time, he sends this reminiscent about his happy days as a young boy in the parsonage garden and the woods around the field, around their home, whether it was in Zundert or in Noonan. And this is the sketch of their home in Noonan that he sent back to his sister in Lise. Her name was Elizabeth, and they called her Lise in 1884. You can see by these muted colors that that's very telling of that drawback to what we would think of as the old masters, where those colors are very somber, they're muted tones. It also has to do with what he could afford to buy at that time to use as paint, and using and reusing canvases because he doesn't have a lot of money to pay for those canvases. One thing that does stand out throughout his career is the use of tree roots and these pollarded trees. They're strangely cut to provide shade at a very specific height and width, and you'll see them in many areas in the French countryside, also in the Netherlands. So he's really drawn into these stark forms and skeleton-like structures. In March of '85, Vincent's father dies suddenly. It's quite a shock to everyone. Vincent is back living at the home in Noonan, however, still kind of at odds with his family. In fact, he's renting a small room at the Catholic Church, and that's an abrasive issue because his father is the parson in the Dutch Reformed Church. After his funeral, after Doris's funeral, the church says that the family will not be able to live in the parsonage anymore because they don't have a parson. They're not part of that employ. And so that really sets them kind of on edge. Vincent gets into kind of a big yelling match with his next sibling, Anna, and he decides he leaves. He just packs himself up and leaves. He ends up in Antwerp and enrolls in the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. While he's in Antwerp, again, besides going to school, now what we don't know is about the money that might have been involved in enrolling in the Art Academy. We can only assume that there was some money that he still had from when he was working for Gupta Lindsay a few years prior to this. He's living in Antwerp. He's going to school. He's not really pleased with the lessons that they're giving him. He also finds out that he's suffering the effects of syphilis, and so he's treated while he's in Antwerp for symptoms of syphilis, and that treatment happens to be mercury and sulfur baths. And I just want to put that out there because it'll be relevant here in a few minutes. The picture on the screen is this painting of a skeleton with a burning cigarette, and it's really Vincent's kind of thumbing his nose at the teachers at the school because they were very strict about, if you're going to be painting live models, you have to be studying skeletons to get an understanding of the human anatomy. But if you go back and you look at some of the earlier works that Vincent had done, sketches, well, let's just say he had plenty of opportunity to see human anatomy prior to coming to school. Throughout his days, medicine for Vincent is really what's calming and healing for him is the overlay of art and nature. That's good medicine to him. He's constantly going back to those things, whether it's a sketch of a bird's nest written on the back of a letter to his brother. The collection of those nests happened to see a bird out by the pond, that kind of thing. He continues to sketch on any little scrap of paper. Again, it could be in the middle of a letter. In the case here, what we call the letter sketches that were sent to his brother Teo. Out for a walk, noticing a barn owl at night, seeing the swifts that were near the towers in Paris. But again, these are reminiscent of the sketches that he made as a boy. They're also very reminiscent of the sketches that accomplished or accompanied Carr's stories in the tour around my garden. quick note about the way paint, we noted about his somber tones, and just look at the way the paint progression, the way it was provided and easily used at the time. Bladders were still being in use. This was usually a pig bladder where the mineral and the oil were mixed together and held in that, perforated and closed with a tack. Didn't work out very well. The second progression was a tube, a glass tube, very similar to the way a syringe might work. Metal tubes came in the 1840s into the 1850s. And I put this up there because Vincent was not happy with the prepared paints. He didn't like the color, he didn't like the texture, and so it was not unusual for him to have the ore ground, personally ground and mixed for him. And we're going to see some of that progression come to light in a minute. The colors that may be well known to you, vermilion red, come from the mineral, which is mercury sulfide. The form of this mineral is ground to create the pigment that then becomes the paint. You may also know it in another form. In the Asian arts, cinnabar, mercury sulfide, cinnabar was made by taking the ground pigment, mix it into lacquer, and then creating layers upon layers upon layers until it's built up so that they can carve. And there's some beautiful, incredible pieces. However, that process puts you in direct contact with the mercury. The color grinder is inhaling some of that. They're getting it on their hands. It's in their clothes. They may have ingested it. And the same thing with the painter. All of these pieces may have come to light. They may have been ingesting any of these, whether it's the lead that's in lead white or the heavy metal cadmium, which provided cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, and so on. The side effects of these very toxic minerals may play into the way that Van Gogh was suffering from the effects of some of this overexposure. Those things include fatigue, depression, irritability, abdominal cramps, rapid heartbeat, low iron in the blood, so anemia, teeth and gum issues, which he describes in a letter to his sister about having to have teeth removed. Now remember, he'd also been bathing in mercury baths. And so you have a situation where he has this buildup of these heavy metals and so on in his body. When he gets to Paris and was living with his brother for a little while, he has the opportunity and the good fortune to meet Julien Tanguy. And Tanguy was the friend to young artists. He was called Father, Père, by the young artists who hung out there. That was kind of like the place to be. Everybody loved hanging out with Julien Tanguy. But he was their cheerleader, if you will. Not only was he an art dealer, he was the color grinder. So he was providing the paint directly to the specifications that an artist would like to have. He also accepted paintings as payment. Not only did he do that from young Vincent, he also did that from other artists. In the portrait that you see on the screen, you can see there are paintings behind you that are reminiscent of Japanese prints. And at that time period, Van Gogh was very intrigued and infatuated with the Japanese style. And so he was recreating those. And they're pretty interesting pieces that are available for you to see. Now, Tanguy was one of the first people to buy a painting outside of Vincent's family. The painting that he bought was The Red Vineyard. This painting is one of the highest priced paintings in the Van Gogh collection currently. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, why are there so many self-portraits of Vincent? Was he vain? No. He might have been. Okay, let's take that back. He might have been a little bit. But working as a very poor, underpaid artist, you have to find ways to be economical. And so by drawing yourself, you don't have to pay that fee to the model. It is at your time frame. It can be any time of day or night. It can be in any setting. You can change the looks, change the light, change the way you paint, and you're the one that's in control of that. And there's quite a number of those paintings that have come to light. In fact, we can easily add one more to this that was just recently discovered in July of 2022. It was a painting that was actually behind another painting. The painting that's known as Head of a Peasant Woman, painted in 1885, and that was found by using a very special type of X-ray that can see through the layers of that canvas. And that was not at all unusual for Vincent to do that, to reuse a canvas as well as many other artists. A number of professional papers have been written about the wide variation of the style of Van Gogh's self-portraits. Some have sought to align his use of absinthe, which is an alcoholic beverage, and some of the other drugs that he might have been taking in the way that they affected his deteriorating mental and physical health as why his style changed. And that's a possibility as well. This is one of the few self-portraits that stands out because it depicts him in full form. He's in action. This is him. He's dressed. He's ready to go to work. He's in his blue painter's frock. He's wearing his straw hat, which he was well known for out in the community of Arles and Orvers when he lived there a little later in life. He's got his tripod, his easels. He's got all of his materials and his canvases. He's on his way to work. You notice that there's not a full depiction of his face. And I think that speaks volumes, that he didn't see the need to include that because the rest of the picture really had all of the emotion that he wanted it. This painting has been listed as missing. It's believed to have been destroyed in an Allied bombing run at a museum in Germany. It's been unaccounted for since April of 1945. Let's go back to that absinthe drink. And what I want to tell you about absinthe is that it has a lot of mystery surrounding it. Absinthe is a high alcoholic content distilled spirit, and so it has the flavor of anise and wormwood, and so that would include things like star anise, sweet. It could have sweet fennel because it has a similar flavor. It could also be green anise. And generally that's what provided the color, is those botanicals that had been macerated and then distilled again, and it kept some of that color. But that very high content of alcohol speaks very loudly, 45 to 75%. The other condition of that is one of the compounds that's found in wormwood is thajune. Thajune is supposed to have been the ingredient that opened the mind for creativity. And there were many absinthe drinkers, and so you might go back and look through that and see that Oscar Wilde or Vincent, of course, is on that list, Ernest Hemingway, and so on. We've got a number of famous people who are part of that. But when we look at the chemical compound, thajune, it's listed as a convulsant. It can cause seizures. It's listed as a neurotoxin. It can cause kidney failure and nightmares, insomnia. And an overexposure, too much thajune, can actually cause a muscle to break down. And the other side of this is what was added into this distilled spirit, because it was unregulated at the time. And so many of the cheaper versions had added herbs or minerals to create a color to kind of trick the buyer, the consumer, into what that was. Some of those additions included things like sweet flag, which is part of the calamus family, and that is known to cause kidney damage. Tansy can also cause liver damage. And these minerals that might have been ground and added to create that pale green color were things like antimony, which is very toxic. It can immediately cause vomiting and diarrhea if too much is consumed. Or aniline green, which is from malachite, and that has a liver toxin. And then copper sulfate, which I just can't tell you how incredibly toxic copper sulfate is. This causes red blood cells to break down. Copper sulfate is what is used when clearing a line of tree roots. So the plumbing line from your house that may have too many tree roots may have been treated with copper sulfate. As I mentioned, he was also being treated for venereal disease. He suffered from syphilis for many years, as did brother Theo. At that time, these were the drugs of the day. They didn't understand the toxicity of the drugs. So was it the disease that might have killed you or caused harm, or was it the combo effects? What we're looking at here is arsenic, of course, and that one was given in tiny little, basically would have been a little lump of a sugar pill, coated and easily swallowed. And then the other one, the other favorite, would have been mercury, which was called calomel during the time. And again, utilizing these two things as medicine, there are many side effects. Besides headaches and drowsiness, arsenic can cause seizures. Um, it can have flu-like symptoms. Again, it can create a low iron situation, so you have anemia. It can have irregular heartbeats happening. Mercury, again, changing the behavior, the issues with your teeth and gums, lack of concentration, loss of memory, depression, and fatigue. And some of these very toxic effects play into some of Vincent's and Teo's deteriorating health. Some of the other medicines that were being used are very similar to what the Lloyds were producing here in Ohio. The Lloyd Brother Pharmacy had many variety of drugs based mostly on botanics. And so the two here are very similar to things that Vincent might have been provided by a doctor in France when he was living there. The medicines that are up on the screen, the first one is glyconda. Now this was a pleasant tasting syrup, but it also had a high alcoholic content, about 60%. It was given for what was known as summer bowel troubles, so it was used in the case of diarrhea. Glyconda contained bicarbonate of soda, rhubarb, peppermint leaf, and peppermint oil. The product made here by the Lloyds also contained golden seal, which wouldn't have been available in the European version. It also might have had cinnamon and been in a base of brandy. This was also used to treat syphilis. So glyconda was also used to treat some of the effects of syphilis. The other two products there, one hard to see, that's called aconite. Aconite is also known as the queen of poisons. Aconite is a type of plant which is also called wolfsbane or monkshood. We do have a native species here in Ohio called northern monkshood. It contains a very potent compound that's listed as a neurotoxin and a cardiotoxin. However, in small doses, it was given as a sedative to ease a person who was suffering nervousness due to mental illness, perhaps. Overdoses of the aconite treatment might have included things like erratic heartbeats, dizziness, short of breath, disturbed vision. And then the other product on the page is digitalis. Digitalis is from the flower that we know as foxglove. You might know that name, digitalis, because it has been used in treating heart conditions. It was used for what was called dropsy, which is congestive heart failure, which involved the amount of fluid, the edema that would build up around the heart. However, it was also used at that time to treat epilepsy. And if we look at some of these other symptoms that he might have been suffering from, that Vincent might have been suffering from, it's very possible that he was having a side effect from the drugs or the syphilis, and they were treating him with digitalis. Some of the unusual side effects from digitalis are erratic heartbeats, but the one that stands out for me the most is the idea that you are now seeing in a cloud, a haze that has a yellow color to it, a yellow hue, and there's halos in the vision. So here are the two pictures that match the flowers. There's digitalis foxglove showing up there, that's kind of a rather pink on a spike, and the other one is monkshood or wolfbane aconite that's showing up there in the purple. As I've noted before, that Vincent was always sketching on little bits of paper. When ideas would come to him, it wasn't unusual for him to sketch a scene with the idea that eventually it may become either a pencil drawing, a pen, it might have been watercolor, and then move into an oil painting. And that was the case with this particular one called Starry Night over the Rhone. He did this drawing and then sent it to his friend Eugene Bach, and he described and said, "Once I went for a walk along the deserted shore at night. It was not cheerful, it was not sad, it was beautiful." And later, as the painting was completed, there are a couple things I want you to notice. First of all, you've got the twinkling stars, but you've also got that yellow halo effect, which we don't know, was he having that as a side effect from taking digitalis, or was he really seeing that in the sky? The other thing I want to make mention to you is that you're looking at that light that's shining in the water, those long streams of light, and that's actually a tribute, if you will, to the artificial lighting that was now in the city of Arles. You now have gas lines that have been run, so there are street lights, street lamps, and lighting within homes provided by gaslight. And that became a really important part of some of the night pictures that Vincent painted. This particular piece was one of the few pieces that was ever publicly shown prior to Vincent's death. It was shown at the Society of Independence Exposition in Paris in 1889. Vincent's love of sunflower, he loved the colors yellow and blue anyway. We see that a lot in his paintings. But living in Arles, surrounded by so many wonderful fields of not only cornfields and wheat fields, but you also have fields and fields of sunflower. And the other part about sunflowers is that when they're available, first, they're not very expensive. You can paint them in all kinds of effects. Even as that is drying and dying out, it has such an incredible interest and a draw to him. He was really in love with these flowers and decided that at some point he was going to paint all of these really wonderful sunflower paintings. He wanted to kind of overload a place that he was about to live and please, hopefully please his new friend Gauguin. The paintings on the screen that you see, the one that has the green vase, was in a private collection in Japan, in Osaka, and it was believed to have been destroyed during another firebombing during 1945. He continues on with so many of these wonderful paintings and writes to his sister saying that he hopes to have them installed in the exposition that was known as what we would think of as the World's Fair in Paris in 1889. So again, you have two incredible paintings that were here that he was hoping to get into that exposition. Vincent has this dream of getting a place where he can have other artists come and stay, a commune, if you will, where they can come and paint with him side by side. They can have that good brain-filled food where they're talking over painting philosophies, materials, views, and that kind of thing. And he actually ends up being able to rent the Yellow House. Now, when I say he, I have to put that in quotations because all of the money being provided to him comes from the goodness of the heart of his brother Theo. Vincent was not working outside of his painting at this time. He set up with Theo that he talks as if they were one, that they were partners. Theo provides for the allotment that pays for the rental of that house. He pays for the renewal of that house and the painting inside and out. The cleaning of it, he pays for all of the furnishings. He pays for the charwoman and the food and the art supplies. But Vincent has this incredible, wonderful dream of having this home where he can invite artists to come and stay with him. A couple quick things of note. When you look at the sketch that's in that lower corner or the painted version of the Yellow House, you can see these kind of odd gray or brown. You don't know if that's a pile of stones. Turns out those are the hand-dug trenches for gas line. The house that Vincent was able to rent so cheaply did not have any gas lines, so there was no light provided unless it was from candles or lamps that were lit, kerosene lamps that were lit in the home. And so you can see progress is happening. The photograph depicts the Yellow House in the early 1940s. Unfortunately, this did not survive the war. It was destroyed during World War II. Vincent is just infatuated with the way he's going to set this house up. He describes his room. He paints it a number of times, but he sends that in letters both to his brother Theo and to Gauguin. He met Gauguin in '87, really liked the fellow, and wanted him to come and be the first person who would come and stay at the home. Gauguin comes. He joins Vincent, but it's only because the good graces of Theo who pays Gauguin to come and stay. Gauguin also lives on a shoestring. He spends his money on women and fine wine and fancy dinners out and hotels. And so he's down on his luck and he accepts the offer to come and stay with Vincent. Unfortunately, these two gigantic egos come together. In fact, I read somewhere it says, where Vincent saw brotherhood, Gauguin saw a contest. And it didn't take very long. Within less than 2 months, that vision, that utopian vision that Vincent had, has started to unravel. The tension's building, and by mid-December, Van Gogh and Gauguin are just kind of always at each other. They're agitated and arguing, and at a certain point, Gauguin announces he's going to move out. On December the 23rd, Vincent receives news. He gets a letter from his brother announcing the engagement to Johanna Banger. And Johanna had met Vincent a couple times, but Vincent may have felt like he was losing his friend Gauguin. He's going to move out. Now he feels like he's going to be losing his brother. That also means he may lose his financial support because Theo will have this new family to provide for. He's very distressed. He's drinking a lot. He's not eating very well. He's frantic and fearful. And I might add also, at that time of the year, you're losing the sun. So it's dark by 4:30 or 5 o'clock. On the night of December the 23rd, another argument breaks out, and Gauguin storms off to stay at a local hotel. He's just kind of had it. Regretfully, Vincent really breaks from his rational mind, and he cuts off his left ear. It is true he does take that ear to a brothel, but the person he presents it to is not a prostitute. It's to a young woman who was considered too young to work in that field. She was the housekeeper or the cleaner at the brothel. And he'd met this young woman who he described as Rachel, a name that he'd given her, not her real name. For whatever reason, he decided to gift her this ear. She fainted, or nearly fainted, and the police were called. They came and found Vincent and took him to the hospital, where he was under the care of Dr. Felix Ray. It's found that he cut off that part of his ear, and that has always been one of the great mysteries of life. What was the situation with his ear? Well, an art sleuth, an amateur art sleuth, Bernadette Murphy, she had been an art history teacher, but she was also a researcher and had done work in genealogy, was able to find out and track back that there had been a description of the piece of the ear that had been cut, which was nearly all of it. In fact, he had also nicked an artery. But it was on the personal writing pad of Dr. Felix Ray, and it turned up in the archive that had belonged to Irving Stone, who was the author of Lust for Life. And that was in the archive of now one of the universities, Berkeley, I believe, there in California. And so that kind of described that information. The treatment given to him was a silk dressing, which was new at the time, soaked with camphor and carbolic acid. And it's amazing that he didn't lose his life over it. Once he was released from the hospital, he was back at the Yellow House by himself. He was trying to follow the example and be a good patient, if you will. And this painting was kind of that notice back to Dr. Felix Ray and his brother to say, look, I'm really trying to follow the advice for good health. On the table is a copy of Raspel's Health Annual, and it describes good eating, fresh food, paying attention in terms of your consciousness. Onions were considered one of those reparative foods. The pipe and tobacco, the calming effect that would have on Vincent, that turns up a lot in his life. The pot of camphor, which was one of the Raspel's cure-all, and likely also used on the bandage, giving that healing scent coming back into the home. And the empty wine bottle, supposedly a pledge for moderation in the future. Vincent decides he understands he really cannot live on his own, and the townspeople also decide. They have formed a petition and ask that he is taken away to be institutionalized. He works with his brother and finds a place at the asylum in Saint-Remy, which is about 15 miles north of Arles. He goes to stay there, where he's treated for his conditions. He has a balanced life in that they are caring for him in a healthy way. He has good food. His room is kept clean, and because there aren't many people in the asylum at the time, they give him a room downstairs so that he can draw and paint. They see that as part of his healing. He'd been talking about utilizing stars and the sky and the night sky for quite a while, so this sketch was made and sent back to Theo describing his idea. And when that painting comes to life, of course you all know it as Starry Night, This was painted as the view from his room at the Saint Remy Asylum. However, what I must tell you is that some of that is conjured, it's imagined. The cypress tree, one of his favorite shapes and turns up a lot in his paintings, and also the little village below, does not actually show up if you were standing in that spot. There is no cypress tree and there is no village. The stars correctly noted there, but look at the swirls, whether he was seeing those through a result of the drugs that he'd been taking, whether this was all an imagination. And this particular painting was basically languishing in obscurity. In fact, it wasn't called Starry Night. His brother called it The Village in the Moonlight, and Vincent himself called it Night Study or Night Effect. In fact, it wasn't named Starry Night until part of an exhibition in Rotterdam in 1927, and that's what it's known to this day. Again, going back to nature, always having that calming effect, it's the calming companion that Van Gogh goes back to. And he overlays his art throughout the years and his effect in nature, and those two things come together and help make calm in his life. And so he writes about finding what he describes as a death head moth, which was also described in Carr's manual from 1851 and illustrated as well. And while what he paints is not a true death head moth, he actually has painted the giant peacock moth, and I have pictures there that you can see the difference. The one identified as the death head moth does actually look like there's a skull right on the back of the top side of in between the wings. This is very reminiscent of the things that he was seeing in Carr's book. Vincent, after about a year's time and creating more than 150 pieces while living in Saint Remy, the asylum becomes a little more crowded and a little less friendly in the safe zone for Vincent. And he pleads with his brother to move him to someplace else. And on the advice of another artist, Camille Pizarro, to brother Theo, they connect with Dr. Gachet in Auvers. And then he is permitted to move out of the asylum, and he goes to stay in the little town of Auvers. Now, he's not living with Dr. Gachet. He's not in a hospital or an asylum. He's taken a room at the inn that's managed by the Ravoux family. And that actually helps him very much because they're quite friendly. They provide him food on a regular basis. His room is kept clean. They ask how his day is going. They kind of at least check in with him while he's there. And he enjoys his time with Van Gogh. Van Gogh enjoys his time with Dr. Gachet, but he describes Dr. Gachet as very eccentric, which I find that quite interesting. He wants to paint this portrait of Dr. Gachet, and you can see there's a drawing there on the screen as well. And Gachet liked the idea so much, but he asked Vincent to please provide a second painting so that he could keep one. And Gachet was also an artist and collected art of the artists of that time period. He'd been treating other artists, as I mentioned, Camille Pizarro had also been one of them. This particular painting of Dr. Gachet has been valued in today's market at $82.5 million, just to give you the idea. Vincent created a lot of paintings, sketching and painting wheat fields and cornfields more than a dozen times. And this particular one, he wanted to express the stormy skies, to express his sadness and loneliness. And he also talks about that in a letter in early July, late June, early July, to his brother Theo, describing a darkening tone and prospects growing darker. I don't see a happy future. Yet the letter he sends to his sister and mother at the same time, he describes the complete opposite. He describes how healthy and invigorating he finds it to be out on the countryside to paint. In the letter to his sister Will and mother, he describes the gorgeous colors of the wheat field as boundless as the ocean, delicate yellow, delicate soft green and purple, everything under the sky of delicate tones of blue and white and pink and purple. I'm in a mood almost too calm. This painting perhaps may have been, and we believe now, to be the last painting that was done by Vincent. But I want you to take a step back and listen to some of the things that he also said setting himself up for some of the feelings that he was having. Back in 1888, he wrote to Theo saying, you know, painters being dead and buried speak to the following generation or several generations through their words. In the life of a painter, death may perhaps not be the most difficult thing. And so I just keep thinking about when he talks like that, that this is a predictive farewell. On July 27th, 1890, Vincent has breakfast with his friends at the inn where he's living. Again, he's become that man of routine in that aspect, which helps him stay very focused on his art. He gathers his painting materials as he's done for weeks. He heads out to find the scene for the day's work. When he doesn't return for dinner, the innkeepers begin to worry. Vincent arrives back around 9 p.m. He doesn't look well, and the innkeeper Ravoux asks, "Are you all right?" And he reveals that he's shot himself. There's a wound near his heart. They send for the local doctor and also Dr. Gachet, who treats the wound. They cannot remove the bullet. There's really no hope for recovery. A message is sent to Vincent's brother, who arrives the next day and stays until Vincent passes. They talk through the night. He keeps asking him about getting some more help, and Vincent says, no, I really want to go. And Theo pleads with him, please, let's get some help. And he says, no, please not. The sadness will last forever, and that's what his last words were to his brother. Theo's health was also failing, and when Vincent died on the 29th, and the funeral was on the 30th, Theo just was starting to fall apart. He arranged for the funeral. Artists came. They spoke highly of him. Dr. Gachet could hardly get out a few words. He was buried there in a cemetery in Auvers. And he goes back home, but is not well. Time passes. He has a young son, but Theo is not doing well. His health is also failing. As I mentioned earlier, he too had been suffering the effects of syphilis, which can end up untreated, affecting the brain. And he ends up with a brain infection, which causes his mental health and his an aggressive spirit to come out, which was unlike Theo, was just a sweet fellow from what I've read. He dies on January 25th of 1891, just 6 months after the passing of his brother. Originally, he was buried in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Jo had taken him basically, quote unquote, back home. But she realizes that those two brothers really need to be together. And in 1914, she arranges for Theo to be disinterred and reinterred in the cemetery in Auvers, so they lie in repose side by side. And the graves were covered with ivy that had been taken from Dr. Gachet's garden. And those two lie in repose still there today. I really want to get you thinking on some positive notes. We're still finding out so much. There's new information coming out about Vincent's life and new paintings being authenticated all of the time. Most recently, this very last painting had been described, and the location of this, the tree roots. A senior researcher at the Vincent Van Gogh Museum, when the museum was in lockdown during the COVID of 2020, working from home, he remembers seeing a postcard that was from Auvers. They were collecting items that were from the places that Van Gogh had been living, and this was one of them. So here we see this postcard on this little road, only about 300 feet from the inn that Vincent was staying. And you can see that hillside with the gnarled trees. And then the researcher goes so far and works with the team there at the museum, and they overlay the pieces from Vincent's work. And so now they actually went out and they had a person find that place on the road and clear that. They made a dedication to that spot. Anyone can visit now, and amazingly, some of those tree roots are still there. We're talking more than 130 years ago. The ceremony was provided on July 28th of 2021, and so you can see that that's one of those things where all of these bits of information are still high on the list of things that people want to know about Van Gogh. I really hope that this has changed your mind in thinking about Van Gogh and his life and times. sure I say thank you. Thank you so much to the staff, the very kind staff at the Lloyd Library and Museum for their support in providing a place that I can present the lecture and providing some of the research materials and the Lloyd pharmaceuticals that were used in this presentation. Letters and sketches, references to paintings. Thank you all, and credits given to those who allowed me to complete those in this lecture. I'm glad you're able to join me today. Again, my name is Carol Mundy. I'm a naturalist and speaker in Cincinnati, Ohio, and this has been The Nature of Van Gogh. And I just want to make sure that you go into this with an open mind and a much wider viewfinder when you're thinking about Vincent in the near future. I also